Our buddy Revue and I are going to take you on a whistle-stop tour around Wilf to see what different countries and different regions have done in response to shark attack. We have known for many decades that the three most dangerous shark species globally are the white shark, which we generally find as a major problem in cooler waters, for example, Cape Town, California, Argentina, Western and South Australia, and two tropical species, the bull shark, or those you, the Union, know it as the bulldog shark, which I think is a very appropriate name, and the tiger shark. These are more tropical species, and so we find that those are the two species that are a major problem. If we look at Gavin's International Shark Attack file later, we can see that there are hotspots around the world with shark attacks. And often, those places were all free of those species. The bull shark, the white shark, and tiger shark occur. Red Dalpool on the east coast of South Africa, where I operate, and on the east coast of Australia, on my Tech operates. But shark attack. The number of deaths is far less insignificant in relation to the number of people that drown the CAPU. Many of us, I'm sure all of you in this room, are competent swimmers. We go to the ocean, we can safeguard ourselves against drowning, but we have no way of safeguarding ourselves against shark attacks. And it's very unfortunate that shark attack, though it's a low probability event, has a very, very high impact. And see in many parts of the world where a cluster of shark attacks exceeds what we would term the tipping point. In other words, local public anti-shark incidents where they see a particular tipping point and there's no way we can determine it, we then end up with a crisis situation. And everybody is up in arms because they want the government to respond. These are some of the places we're going to visit today in our global overview. What sort of interventions are there? Well, the most simple way is to create a barrier. In other words, you keep sharks and humans apart. That is very easy where the water is calm, but so many of our beaches are open surf beaches, and it is absolutely impossible to maintain physical barriers in those environments. So that's why in many parts of the world they have resorted to catching and removing sharks from the nearshore waters. And that's what we term shark control. In other parts of the world, they don't use shark control, they use detection beads. We're going to explore those. And they're often in many places, they use all of those. But perhaps the most important is the underlying fundamental basis for all these interventions is the need for sound research. We need to understand what the sharks are doing, why they're there, when they are there, and we need to convey that information to the general public so that they can modify their behavior if necessary to reduce the chance of an event. So let's start off with exclusion nets. Hong Kong is well known for its exclusion nets. They are there only seasonally. Why? Because they have typhoon season, so they take the nets out during winter. Reunion, we know there are two beaches, Bushpa and Karon that have exclusion nets, and a lot of the other beaches near Syrian surf. And it's very, very difficult to provide any sort of barrier. You are fortunate in many places on the west coast that you have the natural lagoon, and that provides a safe natural barrier. And it costs nothing, and it's really immersive. Hairtown, we have one beach, Fischl, which has nets. This is very different from the others in that the net is removed every single day. There's great concern about entablement of whales, seals, and dolphins inside that net. So every single day is that net removed in the afternoon and the morning. Obviously, it depends on the weather and the time of the year as to whether that net will endure a week. Western Australia had a major problem with the shark attacks about 50 years ago, and they are fortunate that many of their beaches are very sheltered, so they can install a number of these barriers. There are some alternatives available, based on South African technology. The shark barrier, which is actually PVC pipes, and they contain magnets, because we know that sharks are very sensitive to not only magnetic fields but electrical fields. The electrical shark cable that you see on the right is something which has been developed by my organization, the Sharks Board, and is still very much in the development stage. But we know that sharks are incredibly sensitive to electric fields, so it's certainly something to explore. But again, the problem with these sort of structures is that they will not maintain open surf beaches. And we know that surfing is so popular globally, and that is probably one of the biggest challenges that we face, is to provide protection to the surfing community. So let's look at shark control. And there are three very, very well-known programs that use shark nets. Now, these nets are not physical barriers. Each net is only 200 meters long, 6 meters deep. They are laid off the swimming beaches in water that is anything between 8 and 10 meters. So this means that the sharks can swim around the sides of the nets, over the top of the nets. They're never intended to create physical barriers. We are very fortunate in that most sharks are active at night, so they tend to move inshore to feed at night. And although shark nets have been incredibly successful, I think if we all of a sudden had this mad craze to go swimming at night, we may well find that the success of those nets is reduced. In New South Wales, the nets are removed in winter. The water's quite cold there, but it's also because whales have recovered incredibly in the last few decades. And so historically, whales were low profit. Any whale that encounters a kill net is going to get entangled. And one of the main reasons we take the nets out in winter in New South Wales is because of the threat of entanglement of whales. Back home at KZN, we historically have only fished with nets, but we realize now that the number of whales, you see whales literally every day, that we have resort to the use of beta blinds and remove the nets for the entire whale season. Thus, the nets there all the year round, fish all year round at previously, only because the conditions are favorable. So the other form of shark control is using fishing with bait books. And the conventional term for these devices is drum lines. Why? Because historically there was a large drum, and beneath the drum you had a large interest bait on a daily basis. And these drums, when you fish in amongst the nets where there are combinations of both at a particular beach, and this new Shark Sport only use nets, but we found that nets are very, very unselective. They catch dolphins, they catch turtles, they catch rays, they catch harmless sharks, whereas drum lines are a lot more selective. So we have tended to move away from nets and use more drum lines. Queensland have also had a combination of nets and drums, and over time they have also reduced the number of nets and rely more heavily on drum lines. So what is interesting is the conventional shark fishing program in New South Wales, which is the oldest program, started in 1937. They had restricted themselves purely to deployment of nets. They do not have drum lines or the care beaches of Sydney. Sorry, let me go back there. What is very interesting was what happened in West Australia. It was a spade shark tax, and we were very surprised because they rejected the use of any sort of fishing here at Trommelite. And I would have thought, because New South Wales previously were using shark patrol measures, that maybe they would be introduced in Western Australia. There was a huge public outrage, and I think this reflects the change in people's attitudes over time. When shark nets went in 1937 and 1952, people weren't too worried about sharks. In fact, many people felt the only good shark is a dead shark. Whereas people have become more light, more environmentally aware, and we realize that we've had to modify our behavior and our modus operandi in trying to address this particular problem. And therefore, in a way, I was quite surprised to see the response in Western Australia. Recife, Brazil is an interesting case. They had a serious outbreak of shark attacks, many fatalities. They didn't want to introduce gas. They decided to introduce drum lights and log lights, which are very similar to what is being used here in Reunion. But their objective is not to catch and kill, but to catch and transfocate. So they will service the gear regularly. If there's a bull shark and a tiger shark, which are the problem species in Recife, if one of those individuals is caught, they will actually escort it out to sea, tow it out to sea, and release it into heavy water. And amazingly, that program has been incredibly successful. The problem with that particular program is they ran out of funding. So funding stopped in 2014, and unfortunately, the incidence of shark attack has returned. And it shows you that when you're in this with the long road. In other words, you can't implement measures for a limited amount of time and then hope you can stop, because these measures are expensive. Unfortunately, you have to have the long-term commitment. What is also interesting about Recife is it seems to be one of the few places where we get a really good handle on why all of a sudden we had this outbreak of shark attacks. And what happened was they constructed this port, Swapi, a short distance south of Recife, and what they did was they stirred in this particular area, there are 4 different rivers with an incredibly productive ecosystem with mangroves, and we know that those are the favorite grounds, nursery grounds, or bull sharks. And the conclusion is that by this particular area to construct port, today you can see it in the background, that it caused the displacement of large numbers of bull sharks, and they flew further north up the coast, and that's where they came into contact with a lot of surges and bathers, and hence the spiky shark attacks in the early 90s. Reunion has had problem since 2011. Their scientists came up with this incredible invention. It's called a spot drum line, or catch alert drum line. And instead of just fishing for sharks with a bait underneath a drum and letting them die, this system triggers an alert. So at the moment anything is hooked on the drum line, it sends an alert to the fishermen. You're fortunate here on the west coast, you've got a number of small harbors, so it's easy for you to go out at night. And these spot drummers only set at night. We can go out, the fisherman goes out, examines the catch. If it's a non-target species, in other words, anything other than that tiger or a bull shark, that you will be released. If it's one of the target species, then that animal is retained. And this is incredible technology, and as a result, it's been widely used in Australia. So hats off to the team in the union that developed the smart. Yeah, there's a little bit more information about the drum lines, the smart drum lines. As I say, they've been widely used in New South Wales, Australia. The difference there is that they are fishing during the day. And it's something that was mentioned earlier, that every region has a different way of using technology. It's not a case of one solution fits all. And it's interesting, I mentioned Western Australia rejected the ordinary drum lines, they rejected shark kits, and they also felt that spike drum lines were going to be totally big. And now we move to detection, human slayers. Sarah's program at Cape Town, the Shark Spotters program. Fortunately, the geography lends itself to using humans to spot for sharks. Why? Because there's very high ground, very close to the sea. The water is generally relatively clear. Perhaps the most important factor is that the prominent species here, which is the white shark, spends a lot of time swimming close to the surface. So it's relatively easy to spot. Unfortunately, you know from our own experiences that bull sharks, they often favor very murky water, so you won't really see them. And even when the water is clear, they tend to swim very close near bottom, which makes it very difficult to use some sort of human surveillance system here in Reunion. So as a result, you have introduced the Vigie systems. Just a short note, you see the flag system. The flag system that's used in Cape Town at the beaches to communicate that information. The more sophisticated forms of surveillance obviously use technology. Helicopters are very effective, but incredibly expensive. Maybe in a small area like Reunion, you can fly around the area relatively quickly, but in places like Australia, you've got huge sections of coastline, and it's very difficult to maintain constant helicopter surveillance. So as a result, drones are becoming more and more popular, and obviously a lot more cost effective. This technology is going to take a little bit of explaining. Scientists tag sharks and other animals. The most simplest form is to put an external tag. We would call it a spaghetti tag, because it looks like a piece of spaghetti that they stick into the body, and they can learn about movements. But they'll only get two pieces of information: where the shark was tagged and where it was recaptured. We don't know what happened in between. So we can use satellite technology, track animals. Satellite technology works really well with whales and dolphins and turtles. Why? Because they spend a lot of time at the surface, and yet the signal can be transmitted to the satellite. It's more difficult with bull sharks. You have to use modified satellite tags. The other, and obviously satellite tags are very, very expensive, so somewhere in between ordinary tag and the satellite tag is a more affordable option in terms of an acoustic tag. An acoustic tag puts out a unique signal. It is detected by an underwater receiver. So researchers will build a network of receivers along the coast, and sharks will be tagged, fish could be tagged, all sorts of animals can be tagged, these acoustic tags. And if that tag animal passes within a few hundred meters of the listening station, its presence will be recorded. The only way to obtain that information is for the divers to go down, remove the listening stations, bring them back to the laboratory, download the information. So these advanced devices here provide real-time information. So in other words, if a tagged shark swims past one of these stations, the information is available instantly and can be used by the lifeguards to modify human behavior as people get out of water, and it can be made available to the general public. The limitation with this technology is you have to tag a huge number of sharks. No good tagging 20 or 30. You have to tag huge numbers. And we know, for example, in New South Wales, they've tagged 1,400 white sharks. And that's getting very close to most of the population. And it's only when you're able to do that you can really use this sort of information. Okay, as you've seen, there's no single solution. It's often a case of using combinations. They have to be adapted to local conditions. Got to make use of technology, the smart drive lines, acoustic tags, satellite tags. We have to improve our knowledge of these animals. It's no good trying to go in blindfolded because we don't know anything about the animals. It makes it very difficult to come up with a meaningful strategy. Australia, which is probably the world leader in the use of all this technology, you have seen that there are a number of different programs, and they vary from one state to another. There's no nationwide solution. And then, as I've said before, education is really, we've got to get the scientists and the managers of the program have got to get the information to you so you can manage your behavior. Just some examples of education and outreach on the lecture. Chris those people what they call shark shacks, which they move around beach to beach, and its education program. One of the advantages of using students is that they can help communicate the message. And then we see on the right-hand side what they're using Australia, we're in this Shark Smart system. And in some states, they have a Shark Smart app. So you can actually look up information from the app to determine where you can swim. And so just to put it all in some sort of global overview, what we've got on the top, we've got Reunion, California, New South Wales, Queensland, West Australia, New Caledonia, KZN, and then Cape Town. And you could see there's a huge difference in the amount of money ever spent annually on those programs. What is also evident is that not every area use exclusion nets, not every area disables this should use surveillance. Not every area wants to have shark control. In other words, they don't want to kill sharks. And in some areas, they more so than others, the use of from smart technology like sponge on mice and the acoustic encephalotiny and the real-time alert, for that costs a lot of money. So you can see that those programs that are associated with that technology have the highest budget. But what's really important is the fact that research and education are fundamental to all of those domains. So take-home message is we're there not just to protect human life, but we're there to protect the economy. Because unfortunately, we find there are people that are selfish and say, you don't mind the risk, we'll happily going to this. But unfortunately, invariably, when there's a shark attack, particularly if it's a serious one, it is all over beer, and it tends to have an adverse effect on local tourism. Shark control is very expensive, both in terms of the cost, but also potentially environmental impact, particularly if you're using gill nets, which are not very, very selective and tend to catch animals like dolphins, turtles, and rays. Countries and regions are turning more and more to develop e-technology. As I said before, as Qatar and Sparrow Greats move forward to help us reduce the risk of shark attack without necessarily associate mortality of the type of animals. We've got to research these animals don't all behave the same, move around a lot. And what's really interesting for behavior unit is I'm used to dealing with continental situations where you've got large stretches of coastline. So these animals are moving up and down. It's a very different scenario. These animals are moving around the island. What do we know about going to Mauritius? What do we know about going to Madagascar, where they spend all their time around the island? How much time do they spend on the east coast versus the west coast? All this information is fundamental to helping solve the problem. Communication, outreach programs, these are incredibly important, influencing human behavior. One of the things that I was fascinated to discover was that New Caledonia was that they had a swimming beach that's very close to the harbor. And the fishermen were coming back when they catch, and they were filleting their fish and throwing the carcasses into the water in the harbor. And what happened? Attracted bull sharks. Bull sharks moved out in the harbor, and they caused the problem that developed swimming beach. So just basic things like that are really very important. And it's really a case of finding a balance. We've got two extremes. People who say sharks are sacrosanct, the people who say the only good shark is a dead shark. And we have to find that balance in the middle. Can't satisfy everybody, but I would like to think most people think moderately, and they'll understand that there is a risk, that we need to try and reduce the risk. We cannot afford to exterminate every shark to make that risk disappear completely. And obviously, adapting whatever solutions are available to suit global conditions. Thank you very much.
more